Hi everyone, welcome to this ProcessMaker 3 training session, which is part of the beginners training series powered by Diamond. I am your host and trainer, Afe Araram. For our fifth session, we shall be discussing part 2 of the topic designing forms in ProcessMaker, and our focus shall be on Dynaform Web Controls. At the end of this session, you should be familiar with the controls that are available in ProcessMaker for you to design your forms. And in addition to that, you should know about importing and exporting Dynaforms. Shall we begin? So in our last lesson, we talked about variables and the responsive Dynaform designer. And as usual, we use our tutorial playground process as a way or an avenue for playing around some ProcessMaker concepts. And we created our first Dynaform. And so get into edit mode for that Dynaform. Web controls allow users of our process to interact with our form. And remember, we've already talked about the web controls toolbox, and that for us to be able to create or structure our Dynaform that users will use, we need to drag controls, web controls into the form and then define or configure the properties of said web controls. So another thing we need to recognize, or something else we need to remember rather, would be we talked about the web container, the form container rather, that at the boundary of this rectangle we can see in the form canvas or form designer canvas is this shaded border. And once you click on it, you can see that it's the properties of the form. The properties of the form are displayed. And if you look within this rectangle, you can see a row. So a row in your Dynaform modeler or designer in ProcessMaker follows the same concept like you have in a CSS in a CSS library like Bootstrap. Okay, so a row has 12 columns, and you could divide that row. Clicking on this row, you see that the column span is 12, and the type of this part of the form is a row. You can add rows upon rows as you structure your form. You can reposition rows. You can reposition elements or your web control or your form elements. Now, a row can be divided into segments, like in line or in alignment with the concepts used in Bootstrap. So looking at this property here for this row, you can see 12 is the default because there are 12 columns. We can decide to divide this to 2 columns, 6 and 6. So for us to be able to do that, we type 6 and a space and a 6, and what you have are 2 columns. If we want 2 columns of 9 and 3 to be 9 space and 3, and we'll have something like this. If we need 3 columns of 4 space 4 space 4, and we get 3 equal columns. We want 4 equal columns, that would be 3 space 3 space 3 space 3, and if you click outside, you get 4 equal columns. So for aesthetics and form, no, it's tautology to be saying form. The form of the form or Dynaform form or structure, it's always good to stick to the 6 and 6 rule, meaning you are dividing your rule to 2 equal columns. So when you arrange your form controls or your web controls or form elements, the form looks aesthetically okay. Now, So let's see. Let's take this form. Any role you've already divided, you can always rearrange, but mark you every web control you have put in after the first column will be automatically deleted. So take note of that. So let's go back to 6 and 6. So it tells you the code span change is going to remove columns and content fields. So only the first column is maintained and whatever web control is there will remain. So let's take yes, and we'll go back. We have nothing to lose. Okay, now we've talked about dividing a role. Let's start with each element or each web control that we have in this toolbox. The first one is the text box. Remember in our previous lesson, we said there are two ways we can create a variable in ProcessMaker. One, let me save this and close the Dynaform. One is to create a variable from this variables button on our main or process object toolbox. And we can create the variable like we created employee name, and like we can also create employee department. So that's one way to create a variable, if you recall what we said in the previous lesson. But a second way, like I mentioned then, like I prefer creating my variables using web controls on the form. So which means that as I am creating a variable on this form, I am tying it or binding that web control to a variable. So whenever the user interacts with that web control and data is stored in that, and data is imputed in that web control, the variable bound to it holds that data. Remember, we said variables are like containers, okay? So let's assume I want to, I'm introducing us to our very first web controller, which is the text box. So if I click on this and drag into this role and release, I can choose to create the variable or select an existing variable. So let's say we want to create a field, a text field that will be used for employee name. Since employee name variable already exists, we'll just click on select variable and we see the list of variables here. Sometimes your variables can be so many, you will need to search for them. The moment you type EMP, it will filter and you see all the variables that start with EMP. So I need variable name. I can select variable name. So when we preview this form, what are we going to see? We're going to see variable name like this, okay? Now, every form is supposed to have a title, a form title. And if you look at some forms, for instance, if you look at cash advance that will soon be building, we need to have a form title, cash advance requisition form. And we need to have sections. So for the form title, there is a web control. For the sections, there is also a web control. So let's see how that goes. So there is H1, the title web control. You drag it into a row, and when you click on it to select it, you can see the properties. You can see the ID, title, 0000 up to 1. And you can always change the ID of the form title. And this is always a good practice because sometimes you may need to influence or manipulate the form title using JavaScript. So it's important that you give your form a form title. And the ID we normally take for that is form. So for this ID, we'll be using snake case, form underscore title. Okay. And whatever has to be there, let's assume this is an employee leave request form. That will be employee leave request form. So that's the title. Now you can see that we all agree that the title of the form should always be at the top of the form. In fact, should be the first thing that you see. So for this particular case, it means I need to reposition this role. So remember now that a role is like a container that holds one or more web controls. For this second role, as you can see on the screen, the role contains the form title web control. So if I click at the topmost part of the role, it is the role I have selected. But if I click on the web control, it is the web control I have selected. That is why when the web control is selected, you see the properties for the web control. But when the role is selected, you see the properties for the role. Take note of that. Now, when you want to reposition a web control, it depends on if you are repositioning it on the same role or you want to move whatever role it is to another role position, up or down. So for this particular situation, I need the form title to be the first role. So it means I will need to make the role active by selecting it. And if you go to the top right corner, you see two buttons, two icons. One is what allows you to move. If you hover on it, you see an icon that allows you to move. And the second one is for you to close or delete the role. Once you click on that, everything on the role is deleted. So to move this, I'll click on the first button and drag upwards. You see, as you drag, you see the form will indicate to you where the current position of your movement is going to reflect. So you can see that this is at the top of the form, and I will release my mouse, and there it is. The title of the form is there. Now, let's assume that there's a section of the form that needs to hold employee details. And so that section, sometimes it's good to have your form in sections. That allows the user experience to be much better instead of just dumping all your web controls on the form just like that. It's important for you to group the controls, and each group, if possible, should have a section, a subtitle, a section title. And for that, we need to use the subtitle web control. If I click on web controls to expand this, you see H2 is the subtitle that can be used for sectional headings. So click and drag. You can, at the point of dragging, you can indicate where you want to drop the control. The moment you do that, the responsive Dynaform designer is going to wrap that web control in a role container. So if I release my mouse now, automatically you see that there's a role holding the subtitle control. Now we can change this again. Very good to give IDs to your sections or your subtitles, because there might be a need or a case or a situation where you need to manipulate the section title or refer or reference the section title by its ID using JavaScript. So for this, let's call this section. I normally like to prefix every section ID with section. Then we use snake case again. Remember, for our variables, we'll be using the camel case. But for every other ID we need to create on the Dynaform, we'll use the snake case. So like for our title, form title, it was form_title. But for our section, I like using the prefix section_, then whatever name that section is all about. So if it's employee details, it will be employee_details. Okay? That is the ID. And then you can change the label. I like using regular case for my form title. As you can see, almost for every word on in the statement or in the sentence, the first character is in uppercase. But for my sectional headings, I prefer using uppercase throughout. So this would be employee details. So this. Let's preview and see. So this is what we're going to have. But now, back to the designer, we see that our employee name is holding a full row. To maximize space, form real estate, we need to divide this into two columns rather. So I select the row and change the col span to 6 space 6. That gives us 2 equal rows. And now you can see employee name on one side. So let's preview again. You can see, so the person can type the employee name here, James Bond. Okay. Now we have another column to the right where we can put in another web control. So for that, let's say we need to put in the date, request date. For that, I drag in date time into this second column, release my mouse, and remember we already have a request date, and that is a date time data type. So the moment you select that, then voila, you are there. Let's preview and see. You see the person can type a name here, and you can take the date picker and pick a date. So now let's look at the properties of these two. We've looked at the properties of the form. We look at the properties of our form title. Look at the properties of our subtitle. Now let's one of the properties of this text box. Remember that the very first control we selected was a text box. And now when you select a control, a web control on the designer, the properties pane or panel will show you the properties of that control. So for this text box, you can see that it is tied to a variable name, employee name. Sometimes you may want to change the variable that is bound to a web control. So there's no need to panic. All you need to do is click on this clear button. And once you clear it, you are able to click on this ellipsis button again and go to create the variable name you want or select the variable name that you want. So for this case, let's just go again with our employee name. And when you do that, you can see that the variable name, it's what you have just selected. So if it were to be, we want to change this to employee department, we'll clear this and we'll click on the ellipsis button and select employee department we've already created, and voila, employee department is now the variable bound to this web control. And you can see that the variable data type is string, and we can and the ID too, because when you want to use JavaScript or jQuery to access and manipulate your web controls on the form, you will be using the ID a lot. It's always good to ensure that the ID matches the variable name. It makes life easy for you. The label can be what is there by default based on what ProcessMaker has intuited from the variable name you've given to the web control. Or you can decide to change it to something. I can decide to remove employee from there altogether. And when you preview now, you see department instead of employee department. And this one, we can decide to also change the label for the date time to just dates. And once you preview, you're going to see dates. Okay, so let's go back to our text box and see what other properties can be very useful to us. Now, what is called default value. The default value implies that if the form loads, the value the user will find there. So if we want to create a default value for the date, we can say, is there a default value for dates? Let me check. I hope I am correct. Yeah, we can check and say the default value should always be the 1st of November. And once you preview, you will always see that there. That's what default value does, right? Let's go back to the text web control, text box. Another thing is the placeholder. This is very good when you need to put intuitive instructions or short instructions on what a, a web control, what kind of input should go into a web control. So we cannot say, let's take this back to employee name. Let's select employee name, and then we can come here and say, enter your full name. Now, when we preview, we'll see this. So the person knows that they need to enter their full name, not just their first name or just their last name. It's their full name. And to make it more explicit, we can now type a hint and say your full name is your first name followed, it's your first name, let's say, and your last name. Something like this. We can drag to see more. Okay. Your full name is your first name and your last name. So when we preview, you're going to have, the user will have these hints here, and when they hover on it, they get to see your full name is your first name and your last name. Okay. Is there any other property that can be useful to us here? Yeah. We can use the text transform. So it depends. There are scenarios where you want the input from a user to always be uppercase or always be lowercase or something. So that is where text transform can come to play or becomes very useful to us. Now we can have uppercase. Once we said that, let's preview. Whenever the person types in lower characters, the system will automatically convert that input to uppercase. So let's say John Doe. You click outside, automatically it transforms it to uppercase for you. There are other options here, apart from uppercase. There's capitalized phrase, which is a regular case, and then you could also handle lowercase for you and so on. So let's take it back to none. Then another very good property that exists for web controls will be the validates. And then you put in a JavaScript regex pattern here that you want to use to validate the input from the user. So this is always very good for amounts. In practice, I've always used this for amount feeds or for score feeds. So you have a process, the form where an employee needs to be scored or a proposal needs to be scored, or where users need to provide a value, and it's, let's say for a score, it needs to be between 60 and 100. So you need to put in a regex pattern there and ensures a person doesn't come there and type boy or type 10 or type 1,000. So you restrict the input to what is the desired value, or what the form the desired value should take. And then you also not just provide the regex pattern here. You're going to see a case or a scenario of this in our demo project, the cash advance and expense retirement project that we'll be working on. You also need to provide an error message when the user's input is not validated or does not conform with the pattern, the validation pattern you've created or tied to that particular web control. You want to be able to give an informative message, error message back to the user that this is what I expect. This is the kind of input I expect to come in here. Okay. Then another one, most times when you look at forms, we have what we call required fields and optional fields. Okay. So when you want a field to be required, it's important for you to check this required text box. So which means that when you preview, you see this asterisk close to the label of the web control. That's how you indicate what fields are required. If it's not checked, then the system assumes that that field is optional. The user may fill it or may not fill it. And if the user does not fill that optional field, they will be able to submit the form. But if a user uses a form and does not fill a required field, that user will not be able to submit the form. Okay, then another thing is the display. Yeah, I would like to, for our text control, to show us, talk about this display mode. There are four actually display modes. There's the parents, there's edit, and there's view, and there's disabled. There are times when you want, if talking about the parents now, there are times when you want every web control on a form to be disabled. And so for that particular situation, looking at this form now, if I click on the form container, you can see that display mode is edit. If you preview, users are able to edit the form, the controls on the form. And the display mode of the form is controlling the display mode of the contained or composite web controls, because they are all set to display mode of parents. The date2 is display mode of parents. And what is the parent? The parent is a form container. So if I change the display mode of the form container to view, it means it will affect these two controls, except I indicate that their own display mode is not parent. If you view this now, you see that I'm unable to type into the employee name field, and I'm unable to select a new date. Why? Because the display mode for each of these controls are tied to the parent. Now, if we go back to the container of the form and say disabled, then you preview, these two fields will also take up the display nature of the parent. Now, if I want the date to be static, always 1st of November, I can leave it display mode to follow with the parent that is disabled, and then indicates that the employee name should be editable. So this will no longer be the parent, and what I do will be edit. And when you preview, while this is locked, the user is able to type something here. But most often than not, in practice, we allow the display mode of the parent to always be in edit mode. And then we can also, it's good practice to indicate what you want the display mode for each web control in your form to be. So in this particular case, you can decide it and the parent does not influence them. Okay, there are instances where you want the parent to influence the controls, but in most cases than not, I prefer to define a display mode for each web control on my Dynaform. Okay, so that is for a text box control. What if we want to use a text area? Now remember that for a text box, you drag and drop a text box control from your web controls panel onto an empty row in your Dynaform, and then you have a text control. But what do you do for a text area? A text area control is basically a variant of the text box control. So let's divide this row, empty row again, to 6 and 6, 2 equal columns, and we drag this text area control and put it here. So let's assume that this would be employee comments and click save. Automatically, a variable is created. You select this text area control. You can see the variable name is employee comment and the ID too is employee comment. So the text area control is basically a variant of the text box control, and it allows us to provide an input with which users can enter as much text as possible they want to enter. Okay, So let's preview and see. If you preview, you see that the text box control always takes one line, but the text area control has multiple lines. And there is a property with which you can use to define the number of rows that will be displayed by default for a text area control on your form. By default, it's always 5 rows, but just look at this. I'm going to create an employee comment and create another one called supervisor comment so that you see the difference or you see the impact of what I'm trying to convey. So text area again here, I'm creating a variable called supervisor comment. And if I click save, I have this. But look at this. For the employee control, the employee comment text area control, the number of rows, as you can see here, is 5. Let me change this to 2 rows of display and leave the supervisor comment control on 5 rows of display. When you preview, you have something like this. You see that this is taking a much larger height compared to this because this is 2 rows of display and the supervisor comment is 5 rows of display. I normally like leaving mine in a design using 2 rows of display so that why? Because the users can always extend this if they have much more to type. So they can type as much as they want to type because you can the user can drag to reduce or increase the height of the text field. Okay. Now the next control I would want us to talk about is the drop down. Yeah. So for drop down, just divide another empty row to 2 equal columns. For your drop down, let's assume that for your drop down, we want to create a drop down for departments, for instance, or for gender. Now, the drop down allows you to create a web control or an input field on your form where you determine the inputs, the options a user can select from. For instance, remember when we are creating, let me save this. Let's go to our variables. When we are creating this gender variable as a string, remember as a string, we defined the acceptable variable values, that it is male or female. Now, if these acceptable values are defined during the creation of the variable using the variable button on the process object toolbox, then those options are automatically brought into the form. So let us see. Go back to edit our first form and let's divide this row to 2 equal columns. And let's drag a drop down web control and release here. And we select gender. Now, automatically, you see if I preview that I can see male and female. These were the options, the acceptable values that were defined when we were creating the variable. And wherever you drag that variable or you assign this variable to a drop or a suggest web control on your form, the acceptable values or options are going to come along with it. So to avoid repetition for any variable that I want to use for a suggest or a drop-down control, it is preferable for you to define them at the variable level so that on any form you drag a control and bind it to that variable, the options will automatically be there. If you don't do that, it means anytime you want to use that variable, if you have not defined the acceptable values, on every form you use that variable, you will need to type the acceptable values again to showcase that. Let's say we want to use employee departments. Remember, we have employee departments already existing, and we want to create departments, finance, HRO, IT, Just those three, for instance, and admin, 4 departments. And we want a drop-down control that is tied to the employee department variable. Now, check this out. If I click on preview, this one, we just selected it and the options were there. But for employee department, we did not define any acceptable values. You see that the drop down is empty. So which means I would need to now select employee department and come down to options and then start to create them. So I would say admin, then the label will be admin, administration. Then, sorry, create a second one for finance. Finance to be finance. And for HR, that would be human resources. Then for IT, it will be information technology. Okay, let's apply. So it's when I've done that, then if you look at the properties, you see that the options are showing the options I just defined from the properties panel. And when we preview, you will then see the options here. Now, if I were to start creating another form, a second Dynaform for my process, and I drag in employee department again, it's going to also come empty. And that's why the best thing to do is so let me show you. Let's assume that we delete this entire control, yes, the entire drop down, and we create it afresh. You see that if we select employee department and we preview, it is empty. So whatever options you define for a web control that is a drop down or a suggests, it's only retained as long as that control is on the form. The moment you delete that control, those options are gone. So you will have to start defining the options again and again anytime you drag that or you bind that variable to a drop down or a suggest control. So the best thing to do, let's delete everything and save. Go back, is to go to your variables, locate employee department, edit it, and then define acceptable values. And here we can say admin, administration, create, and then we'll say finance, add, then add another one, which will be HR. So let's add the last one, IT, and this is information technology. Now, like I said, what this helps you to do is that in any form at all that you drag this to 66, okay, we drag it drop down for gender because this already has options defined, it will come with it. Now, if it is suggests, we select employee department, the options will also come with it. So that's the beauty of defining your options. Then you can also add extra options to what you have here. For instance, we can click on options. If I select this suggest, go to properties and click on options. I can add more, but these will only be on this form. It will not follow the variable. So if I go to another form, this fourth department I'm creating, IT, information technology. Let's type it properly. So this will be here, preview, and you see it. But if you go to another form, this information technology will not go with the variable. The variable options that will always be there are the ones you have defined as the acceptable values at the variable level. Okay. So other properties that we may want to check for a drop down, we've already talked about it. Sometimes a drop down may reference a database. Yes. So let's look at that. Apart from typing the defined or acceptable values, you may want to reference a database. So let's access our ProcessMaker database using HDSQL and open it. Once we open and we search for the user table, you see right now there's just one user there. This is a guest that's not useful, just one user. And if we want to write a query that fetches this, we can say it's always advisable that when you are writing your queries, write them in capital letter. Your field names and your table names should be capital, in uppercase, so that you can have that what's this word for it now? That you can have that compatibility when you design a process in Windows and you export it to an instance of ProcessMaker that's on a Linux environment, there will not be conflict. So you remember for Linux, your SQL, your table names and your field names should always be in uppercase. So we'll keep that same practice here. And say select, let's for now say star from users where, so let's put a U here, where U dot user status is equal to active. So let's see, is that the correct thing? Let's scroll to the right. Status is okay, uppercase active. So come here and say active. Now, make sure this is in capital letters, users. And here, U dot the username, we want to go with the user UID, comma, that will be the key, and then the username. Let's use the full name. So that would be a concatenation of the first name and a space and the last name. Okay, let's see what our query is. Okay. Let's see. This is active. Okay, user UID. Then first name and our last name. Where user status. That active should be correct now. So let's see what the problem is. Copy. Paste. Sorry. Copy. Paste. So let's go with first name at the beginning. Let's see what the problem is. Let's just run this. So I think the problem is with the condition. Oh, I didn't spell my active carefully. Yep, that's the problem. Active. Didn't see that. Okay, so let's run the selection. So we have this. So if I take this query now, copy it, and use it in the SQL property of my dropdown, the key of the options for that dropdown will be the user UID And the label is going to be a concatenation of the first name and the last name. So let's see how that works. Let's see how that works. So let's say we are choosing a supervisor. 6. And a supervisor can be any user in the ProcessMaker database. So I will need to create a drop down. Yeah. And then I want to call this supervisor. Oh, sorry. Supervisor. And then we save. Then we come down to, remember now, we are accessing the ProcessMaker database. So the DB connection should be PM database. If you have created a database connection object connecting to an external database, then once you click on this, you will see the database connection object here. So you will be able to select that database connection. But in this particular scenario, we only have a connection to the PM database. That's why PM database is the only option on that list. Well, if we click on this ellipsis button for the SQL property, we are able to paste what we've done there. And once we save, if you preview, you would see now that you're going to see this, which matches with what we got here. Okay, so that's the SQL property for a dropdown. It's the same thing for most controls. If you are able to define an SQL query there, like we said, please ensure your table names and your column names are in uppercase. Okay, and you will be able to do that. For me, I always like putting because by default, if there are a list of options and you preview the form or the form loads, the first option is always there by default, which is not always useful because sometimes a user filling a form may just miss that, and the first option of the drop down may not be the option they actually want to take. So it's good to always, in practice, I like using a placeholder. I just type in select. Once you do something like that there, select, and the same thing, copy, put so this placeholder for the employee department, paste, select. Once you do that, then the first option is no longer selected. So which will require the user now to come here and select an option. Okay, so that's another thing I want to point out for the suggests and drop down. We can manipulate even our text box to our text box has access to the SQL property. Now you can define that. Okay, now moving forward, we want to look at the checkbox. A checkbox control allows you to offer users of your form a binary choice like yes or no, agree or disagree, true or false. Okay. So let's assume we have an affirmation control. We want the user to say, I affirm that I've been able that every bit of information on this form is accurate. We want to use a checkbox for that. So let's see. So if I go to my checkbox control and drag it here, and let's call this user affirmation and we save. Let's preview. What do we see? We can see this checkbox here. And we can also divide this into two parts. Let's see what we can do to give it more usefulness. We can drag in a label control and say, and type a text here. I affirm that every bit of information I have provided on this form is valid and accurate. So let's see how it will look like. So you see something like this, or we can decide to put it each on its own. So this one is here, and we change this back to 12 columns. And when we move this up, and it will appear like this. So the person can click to agree, or don't click to disagree. So it offers your users a binary choice. And if you look at the properties, you see that it has its defined options, and the data type is Boolean. See, the data type is Boolean, and you see the options. It's 1 for true and 0 for false. And you can change this, but you cannot change the key because this is a binary situation. Sorry, a Boolean situation. Okay, now the next control we want to look is the check group. We talked about the single checkbox, but what about the check group? The check group. So the check group control is used to allow your users to select multiple options. Each option is then displayed with its own checkbox, and the options that are checked are stored into the array variable associated with the control. So remember, for the single checkbox, the data type was Boolean. But if you're using a check group control, let's assume these are residential cities. Residential cities. And you want if you go to the options now, we want to indicate Abuja. We want to indicate Lagos, Accra, Freetown, Cape Town, something like this, and you apply. When you preview, you're going to have something like this. And the users can say, okay, I live in Abuja and Freetown. So they can select one or more options. And if you look at the variable type, you see that it's an array variable type. You could also tie your checkbox to an SQL query if you want to give options using data in a database. The next one I want to talk about is the radio web control. So the radio web control is similar to the check group, with the difference being that the check group allows you to select multiple options, or the radio group makes you select only one option from the available options. Okay, so let's call this user cities. The other, remember, for our checkbox group, we call that residential cities. Okay, let's call these work cities. What cities has the user worked in? So click on that, and you see it's tied to a string, because irrespective of the number of options we make available, the user can only select one option. That's why the variable data type is a string for a radio button or a radio group control. You can select the options. So for these, let's say we give options like New York, London, Berlin, Toronto, when we do this, you see this is a checkbox group. This is a radio group. For the checkbox, the user can select multiple options. But for the radio group, the user can only select one out of the available options. So that's something to take note of. Then we've already talked about date time. We talked about the date time, which is this here. But additional information would be, apart from the placeholder, the hint, and whether it's a required field or not, or the display mode, you can select the date format. If we preview what is here, remember we indicated a default value at the beginning of this lesson, that the default value should always be the 1st of November 2024. But the user can also select any other value, like the 6th of December there. But you look at the date format. It's presented to the user as 4 digits for the year and a dash, and 2 digits for the month, a dash, and 2 digits for the day. But we can change all of that here. If you even click on this help icon, you see the possibilities. If we want January, the abbreviated form of the month, then we will need to use 3 M's, as you can see here, 3 M's. If you want to use 1 digit for the day, you use 1D. If you need it to appear as first, second, you use a D and a small O. Just like that. So these is a guide book or guide information of what you can use to indicate the format for your dates, right? So let's say we want it to be show 6th of December, DEC, 6th as 6th, and then a space, then the month as the abbreviated form of the month, and then a space, and then the year, just the last 2 digits of the year. Then it means we would need, look at the day now, for first DO, this one here. And then for the month, we will need 3 M's, 3 capital M's. And for the year, let's look for year. We use 2 Y's. So let's come down here, put a capital D and a lowercase o and a space and 3 uppercase M and a space and 2 uppercase Y. And let's preview. You see, so that's how you can define and determine the date format that is presented to the user. Now, other things you can do in terms of the properties for a date time, you can indicate what the minimum date is and what the maximum date should be. So, for instance, if I want the minimum date to be 1st of November and the maximum date to be December 31st, then the user is trying to do this. The user cannot select any dates before 1st of November, neither can he select any dates after 31st of December. Now, I know you'll be asking, why would I need, of what value will be this if I would need to hard code the date here? So the beautiful thing is that you can use variables to determine this. So if we type a variable here, for instance, at mean dates, and here at max dates. then that will control these values. I don't need to hard code them. So I can programmatically determine what the min date and the max date should be. So I could use, before the form loads, I would have used a trigger. We're going to be having a lesson focused on creating triggers. And we're going to be using triggers for our demo project. So just be calm. Don't worry yourself about what I mean now by triggers. You get to understand when we get to that part of this series. But going back to what I was saying, I could define a trigger to programmatically define the value or determine the value of the min date and the max date. So I could write a trigger, write PHP code in a trigger that will check what is the current year. The current year is 2024. Okay, what's the first date of the year? Assign the value of the first date of the year, 1st of January 2024, to the min date, and 31st of December 2024 to the max date. And with that, I have put a boundary of the range in between which, or yes, between which or in which the user can choose a date, and outside of which the user is unable to select a date. So let's see. That's what will take us now to I want to show us the hidden control. So for our hidden control, let's assume we have a hidden control. As the name suggests, when the user previews the form, you will not see the control. Let's call this min date. Create it, and then another one, another hidden control, and let's call this max date. Now, let's save this. For our min date, let's say the default value is 01-01-2024. And for our max date, it is 31st of December 2024, something like this. Now, remember, let's save. Remember, for our dates here, we specify that the minimum acceptable date is min date and the maximum acceptable date is max date. So let's see whether and we said that we use a trigger to control the value of these two variables, and the values of these two variables at runtime will restrict the user in terms of their range of choice. So if we come down here now, you will see that, okay, we've not been able to properly define that, but we shouldn't be able to select our 10th of January. Let's see, what are we missing? This is min date, and this is max date. Okay, let's solve that by, let's see. Request dates. Oh, okay, I used the wrong format. So it is year, month, and day. Okay, let's quickly correct that. 0101. This one. 31st. Okay, let's see if this works. So you see now, we're unable to select 1st of January 2025. And if you go to this, you see you're even able to select any date in December 2023. So that's how you could determine the min and max dates for your datetime control, and you could also use variables to programmatically determine the acceptable date range there. Same also goes for your default range, but normally we can indicate for our default that it should always be the current dates. So initial selection dates, we can always select it to, let's see, initial selection dates. Let's preview and see. You see that it's always the current dates, which is 10. Today is 10th, so it selects that. So that's what the initial selection dates properties allows you to do. Then the show clear button. Now it is hide. Then let's go to show and let's see the difference. If it is shown, then the person can clear the field. You see this appearing here. But if it is hide, set to hide, and you preview, you're unable to do that. Yeah. Then this other button here allows the user to go to the current date, which is today, which we already set also using the initial selection date. So we've so far so good. We've talked about the text box, the text area, the Dropdown, checkbox, checkgroup, radio group, date time, suggest, and hidden, and even title and subtitle. I've also done label. And remember, we use the label here. It allows you to add informative text to your forms. Now, moving on, let's go to, remember again, one more thing before I jump away from labels. Like I said, the control is used for adding text to your form or to our form. It's also sometimes you may want to use JavaScript to influence the value or the text that is displayed in this label. And so it's important that you give your label an ID. So for this selected, you can call this label underscore. Remember, I said for the variable, for fields that use variables, we're going to be using camel case. But for every other thing every other element on the form that is not tied to a variable, for their IDs, we'll use snake case. So I'll call this label. I like putting for my labels a prefix label. Label, same way I have a prefix for my subtitles section underscore. So I use the prefix label underscore for my label elements. So this I'll call label formation. And so I am able to then use JavaScript to influence or manipulate this label by using its ID on the form. Let's see what we've done, and let's see what other web controls are left for us. Okay, there is the link, there's image and file, and all that. So let's go quickly to our link. The link control is used to add a hyperlink to the form. So for example, you have a form and you want to indicate, put a link there for terms and conditions. All you need to do is drag a hyperlink web control to the form. And once you select it, you can choose to remove the label and then display text, say terms and conditions, and then the href now, which will be the hyperlink reference. You put in the URL here, and when you preview the form, you have something like this, terms and conditions. Okay. Now, the next one, it's also good for you to determine the name and ID of your link elements. For this, it will be link underscore terms underscore conditions. That way, when you are looking at the variable, the IDs in your JavaScript code or logic, you're able to know that that particular ID is pointing to a link web control. So I like using the prefix link underscore for my link web controls. Now, the next one we'll need to look at is the image quickly. For image, which is this, we can drag this to the form and modify its properties. Again, the ID, I will use a prefix img underscore, and as usual, you can indicate the ref, or sorry, the source. This can be a URL to the image online, and you can indicate other properties like the alternative alt text and what should show on mouse over, as well as the shape, whether it's going to be a thumbnail or a rounded, or the image should be shown in a circular shape. The next control quickly would be the file control. So the file control, this is deprecated. It allows you to upload a single file. It's useful for attachments, but in practice, it's preferable to go with the file upload, which is your multiple file upload. Now let's see how that works. Now, when you drag the multiple file upload to your form, let's say we call this supporting documents, and we save. If we select it, go to properties, you see that its variable type is multiple file. Remember when we're talking about the various variable data types, multiple file was one of them. It's also a form of the array data type, and it allows you to select multiple documents. And from the properties, you can tie a multiple or file upload web control to an input document object. Remember, let me save this and show you that quickly. Remember, we have input documents as a process object, and you can define input documents. And when you define input documents, it makes it easier when it's already defined, that by the time you go to your form and you bind that multiple file upload web control to an input document, it takes on the characteristics of that input document, which will involve the maximum file type, the file extensions that are allowed, the size units. So when you see 1024 kilobytes, this is practically 1 megabyte. So when we preview this form, I'm sorry, I need to log in again. When we preview this form, this is our multiple file uploader control, and you click on this to ask you to select the documents that you want to upload. Okay, now moving on to the panel control. So the panel control, let's see. The panel control allows us to extend the functionality of ProcessMaker Dynaforms by providing us with a blank canvas to add HTML5 code to the Dynaform. So this control is also linked to the external library property of the form that we've talked about before, the external libraries, which allows us to add custom libraries or style sheets to the form. We're going to be using some custom libraries for our demo project later on. But for this, panel, we'll select that. We can give it an ID. It's also good. In practice, I like using panel underscore for this ID. So let's assume, for instance, that we want to connect this to display a YouTube video, using this panel. Then what I will need to do, let's see, we have this video from the Dipole Diamond YouTube channel, about 5 years ago, automating your internal memo approval process. So let's assume you want to demo or we want to display this YouTube video on the form. I'm going to take the URL, this part of it. And then let's go back to the panel and edit it. So we could use an iframe here, iframe. Okay, so yeah, so that's the iframe. Then we can specify some properties, which would be, let's say the width of this iframe is 560, and the height is 315, and then the source, we'll define the source later on, but let's tidy this up and say frame. Oh, sorry, this is that's a typographical error. Frame border, and then there should not be a plus here. It should be equal to. So that's a second typographical error. Okay, so we continue the frame border. We want the frame border to be 0. And then we expect to add another property called allow full screen. Okay, now time to add the source of the video. So we put HTTPS YouTube. If you check what we copied, we are turning this to this u2.be to youtube.com/embed, and then the other string after it. Okay, now let's see if this works. So we save and we preview. When we go down, we see the video. So like I said, the panel control allows us to extend the functionality of the ProcessMaker Dynaform, because we could use the panel control as a blank HTML canvas. Okay, so moving on, let's see what other controls we have left. Okay, we can quickly talk about the submit button. Yeah. So the submit, excuse me, the submit and button controls are buttons that allow the user to trigger an action on the form. So the submit button is used as the name indicates to submit the form. Now, the button control can also be used as a submit button or some other functionality you want on the form. For instance, you want the button to trigger a particular JavaScript code or an Ajax code that uses an API to fetch data or to confirm or validate something on the form. So for that, you can use a button. A button is different from the difference between the button and the submit button, the ordinary button and the submit button is that the ordinary button does not have the submit functionality, though you could also use your JavaScript code to access this button and give it that form submit functionality. It's very easy to do that. We'll see all of that as we work on our demo project. Now so the button has an ID and has a name. It's always important and advisable that the ID of the button matches the name as well. So for this, it would be, let's assume for this button, we need to um, fetch results. So we can put a label, fetch student results, and we can put the ID to be BTN fetch, or I like putting the prefix, putting BTN as a suffix rather. So it will be fetch underscore BTN, and we'll copy what is there and make the name the same thing. So when you preview, you have something like this. So if you click on this, you see that nothing happens because there's no JavaScript functionality tied to this particular button. But for the actual submit button itself, if you have a submit button, you can call this submit underscore BTN, copy this and paste it here. And for this label, it will be submit form, for example. Preview, you have this. And if you click on this, you see that it attempts to submit the form. And because this field is required, it's saying this field needs to have some data input. So that's the submit and the regular button web controls. We're going to be using buttons, the submit button most especially for our demo project. So when we get there, you're going to see it in action. Then like I said, the button control provides us a way to trigger actions that do not submit the form. Maybe to perform a calculation, or go about custom validations, or display a message, or update a field. We'll use your regular button for that, your button control, as you can see here. To submit the form, you would use your submit web control. Now, before I talk about the grid, I want to speak about the subform. So the subform is like a reusable component. So you have for a process a couple of forms that you use at various tasks, but these forms have common fields. So you have employee name from A, from B, from C, from D, and you have a couple of other input fields that appear across all these forms. Instead of designing these fields or dragging these web controls for these fields, for the common fields, into each of the 6 forms for the process, it's really a waste of time. It's advisable to put all of those common fields into a subform. And then you could then use that subform as a reusable component in each of those 6 forms. So you have 7 forms, but one of them is being used as a subform in the other 6. So that's a subform control. I'm not going to use this here, but we'll see it in action during our demo project, as we build our demo project. So that leaves me with the grid control. The grid control is like having a table on your form, a table on your form. So let's show you how that can be. So if you drag a grid control to this part of the form, I like preceding the variable names for my grid controls with the prefix grid. So let's assume it's we want the grid to hold the expense details of a transport reimbursement process. So I will call this grid expense details. Now, when you preview, you will see nothing but just the grid title, and then a button that you can use to add new rows to the grid, but nothing really fanciful is here because we've not added elements, inner elements to the grid. So if you select this, you can choose whether a grid is responsive or you want it to be static. If it's responsive, all you need to do is determine the width of each of the elements, and depending on the size of the screen or the web page, the columns in the grid will enlarge or shrink appropriately. Then you could also decide whether you want the users to be able to add rows or delete rows. You will also can determine the page size, whether the grid should have pagination, as well as the normal required property, the display mode, and the grid title. I normally don't like using grid titles. I prefer, because if you want to do this now, this would be something like this: expense details. And it will show up like this. I normally like using a subtitle and then putting the grid under without using a title for the grid itself. But let's leave it like this. So for an expense details grid, you want to be able to have item description. So a grid is a container that allows us to use other controls within it, but are not grids or yeah. So let me give you an example. I need a text area for the item description. I need a text area for the amount. Uh, let's say I need a text area for the unit price. I need a text area for the quantity, and then I need a file for upload of an invoice for that particular line item. So what happens? I'll now select each of these controls I've dragged into the grid and change their IDs. So this now, for the IDs in the grid, I prefer to use snake case as based on my experience or as a matter of principle. So for this, I have item description, or you could also use camel case. So let's use that. Say item description, and the label will be item description. Then we want unit price. So unit price, and put unit price here. Then we want the quantity. Let's call it item quantity. Then this will be amounts. To follow, let's say item amounts. Then you can call this item invoice. Title will be upload invoice. Now let's preview and see. You see, because the grid was set to be responsive, then we are having this. Okay, now let's see. Sorry, the upload invoice, should be the label, and the item invoice should be the name. Let's preview again. Okay, so we have this. Now we can come and say, okay, the column width for this should be 3 times all of the others. So if these all are 30, as you can, so these are 10, 10, 10, and 10, we can make this 30, and make this 30. And then we can take the rules to be 1. So when we preview it, it's then something like this. So as row 1 size, the user can change the height of that. So this is a grid. This is a grid. If you want it to be, the grid to not be responsive, but you want it to have a static width, then we can come down here and make this say 250. And then price will be 150. Quantity, let's make it 150. Amount 150. And invoice, upload invoice 150. And when you see it, so it's like this. You can make any of the columns to be required. So this, like just for your normal controls, the text area is required. We can say the unit price too is required. The quantity is required. And then we do a calculation on the amount. And we can make this to be disabled. And this is optional. So for the amount, we can put a form of calculation here. We can put a formula to determine what happens for the amount. So we leave these first 3 fields at view fields, or sorry, edit fields, and we leave the amount as a disabled field so that when you view it, it's something like this, right? And we then put a formula to calculate for the amount, and that's quite easy. If you take the ID of this field, which is unit price, and the ID of the other column, which is the item quantity, all we need to do is to come to the amount column, click on formula for edit, and type item quantity asterisk unit price. And when we preview, we can add more columns to the grid. And if you were to type unit price as 10 and quantity as 6, see that the system, the grid auto computes the value for the amount based on what has been imputed on this other rule, or the columns for that particular rule. So 2.5, and if this is 100, it will calculate that as 250. So that's how you can use formulas for grids. And then you can decide to, if it's a grid that the user needs to impute data, then you may allow the user to add or delete rows. So add rows and delete rows using these buttons. But you can also disable the delete and the add row buttons from appearing by unchecking these two. So if I uncheck delete and have only the add row, it means the user can add a row, but will not be able to delete any row he or she has added. And if I uncheck the add row, it means that the user will not be able to add any new row and will not be able to delete any existing rows. So those are the properties for a grid control. And with this, we have come to the end of this lesson. I hope you've learned a lot. See you in the next lesson.